This is Garis, masculist, MGTOW flyers. That is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 579, entitled Masculist Hatred of Forced Fathering Women. Description. I watched the movie The Red Pill, in which an audience of 90% women almost unanimously clapped in favour of a woman tricking her husband into fatherhood by stopping her birth control. I felt such a murderous, masculist-soldierly hatred at this that it motivated this flyer, which maps out how masculists can overcome women's hardwired view of men as sexploitable cash machines to be robbed and abused. It involves a sex war in which thousands of monoconscious, misandrist, feminist judges who use the law to force men into unwanted fatherhood being murdered by masculist soldiers until the politicians legislate the para, that's paternity, rejection, right. The flyer itself. Masculist Hatred of Forced Fathering Women by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Recently, I watched a full movie by Cassie J called The Red Pill, which is a docu-movie on the men's rights movement from the perspective of a monoconscious feminist. By the end of it, she claims that she's no longer a feminist. I had seen trailers of it some years back and heard about the opposition it created with the monoconscious, bigoted feminazis who were totally brainwashed by feminism that gender oppression is strictly a one-way street. There was one thing in it that really caught my attention as a masculist, that made me feel real hatred, not just anger, at some of the major gender crimes that women commit against men. At the 58.5-minute mark of the movie, a black woman is being interviewed stating that, quote, "So before we were married, he promised me we would have 2 kids, and now he doesn't want any more. My friends think I should trick him and not take my birth control." End quote. The interviewer, also a black woman, asked the audience, quote, "Clap if you think she should trick him." End quote. And nearly all the 90% female audience clapped. I was more than enraged by this almost unanimous agreement on the part of the audience. My impulse was to take out my machine gun and massacre them, these manslaving, utterly genocentric, misandrist cunts. My next immediate thought was, quote, "My God, here is a clear example of what the MGTOWs call the red pill, which is the very title of the movie. The red pill is the negative truth that women don't love men for themselves, but for what men can do for women. Women have been parasitic of men for several million years. The pre-human baby's brain doubled in size in a mere million years, which posed problems for women, since it meant that the birth canal had to be wider for the larger head to pass through at birth. But there's a material limit to the stress that the hip bone can bear as the birth canal widens. A hip fracture in the ancient past meant death. So evolution solved this problem by having the baby be born prematurely, so that the head could keep growing after the birth. But being born prematurely made the baby useless, incapable of walking and feeding itself, unlike the case with many other animals. Thus, the human mother needed to be constantly present with the baby to ensure its survival, which meant that human mothers could not be running around the savannah tracking down game for days on end, the way the men could. So how did human females survive? Question mark. By evolving to become prostitutes to men, bribing men with sex in exchange for scarce male-hunted meat. The human female is the sexiest of mammals. Unlike dogs or monkeys, the human female is in sexual heat every day of the month. She evolved that way, to be able to bribe men with access to her vagina. Those pre-human females who were in sexual heat less days of the month were at an evolutionary disadvantage compared to those women who could sex every day of the month. Women evolved to be capable of coldly, quickly, disloyally, callously dumping a man who suddenly lost his ability to bring home the bacon to his woman and their kids. Her survival and that of her kids depended on her ability to be able overnight to toss off a man who could not feed her and her kids. So she evolved this ability to toss him off and give access to her cunt to a more sexploitable man who could bring home the bacon. So women evolved, in evolutionary psychological terms, to treat men as sexploitable utilities, and they have no real loyalty to those men who do not provide women with resources. To masculists, this red pill reality makes evolutionary sense, but does not have to be accepted in the modern world, since the female brain is still quite capable of adapting to new circumstances. What are these new circumstances? Answer: the rise of masculism, the rise of the anger and hatred of masculists towards women who commit massive gender crimes against men. Masculists have such a hatred against such women that effectively we kill them slowly by totally ignoring them, not even pumping and dumping them. So, as most men become masculisted, brackets, the way most women today have been influenced by feminist ideas, close brackets, women will be forced into a slow, miserable death, forced to join the fluffy graveyard that in today's world contains a third of middle-aged women who are manless, childless, miserable, and on antidepressant drugs. These clapping women are seen by masculists as forced fatherers. That is, they feel they have the right to force fatherhood upon men, which to masculists is one of the big three gender crimes that women commit against men that make masculists have such a hatred of such women. But in this case, we're not talking about a minority of women, but the large majority. We are talking about a hardwired female expectancy that, as the masculists say, quote, "Men exist on this earth to pay for women to have babies." So how can masculists fight a hardwired female genetic programming to want to force men into undesired fatherhood? Question mark. By killing them, or threatening to kill them. That is, by killing them slowly, by forcing them into the fluffy graveyard, utterly rejected and spat at by angry, hateful, masculisted men, who in time will be almost all men. So the masculists have a lot of propaganda work to do to teach these deeply parasitic, man-slaving women that their forced fathering is such a taboo subject for men, for masculisted men, that if a woman commits forced fathering on a man, then the penalty for that major gender crime will be death. A slow, miserable, lonely, manless, loveless, sexless, childless death in the fluffy graveyard. So how to teach millions of women in Western countries that forced fathering is taboo, that will get women killed? The masculists cannot depend on women fighting for the paternity rejection right, since women evolved to sexploit men, to force men to make them pregnant, since the raison d'etre of women, especially when they get into their 30s, is to have a kid or two. So what will the masculists have to do to make forced fatherhood a major gender crime that will get women killed and to have the para legislated. I really think that it's going to take a war, a sex war, that will take the following form. Jump a few years into the future when there are millions of masculists, very angry, hateful, well-informed masculists, who have a hatred of the deeply misandrist gender laws and feel so strongly a hatred that they are prepared to become masculist soldiers, to kill their enemies, who so oppress men. In this case, forcing men into unwanted fatherhood, manslaving him for 2 decades to pay for a kid he doesn't want, or to pay for a kid that is not even his, in brackets, that is paternity fraud. Once there are millions of masculists, there will be thousands of cases in court where the man is forced into fatherhood against his will. A lot of them will be very conscious of masculist ideas and will tell the judge, the monoconscious feminist judge, that he is a masculist and, if necessary, a masculist soldier who will, if pushed, kill his enemies. More specifically, he will kill the judge and his woman, who is trying to manslave him for 2 decades to pay for a kid he doesn't want. He can point out the massive hypocrisy of monoconscious feminists who have the MARA, maternity rejection right, so that women have the legislated right to reject an unwanted pregnancy that could ruin her life, but men don't. Men are seen by a misandrist, monoconscious, feminist-controlled court system as cash machines to be robbed and abused by women. He tells the judge, quote, "If you force me to be an unwanted father, forcing me into 2 decades of man's slavery, I will kill you and my woman for this massive gender crime that fills me with murderous, soldierly hatred." There are now millions of masculists and hundreds of thousands of masculist soldiers who are at war against women's massive gender crimes. So you have a choice. You suppress your hardwired misandry or you die. I know you don't care about men's welfare since you are female and you evolved to be like that, but you are also human with a strong survival instinct that we masculist soldiers take advantage of, threatening you with death if you don't stop your massive gender criminality. You must push the parliaments for the legislation of the para, or we masculist soldiers will kill thousands of you monoconscious feminazi judges whom we masculists have such a hatred of with a murderous passion. To masculist soldiers, manslavery is slavery and a war issue. So you must become female masculist, that is, bi-conscious, or you will not belong for this earth. When thousands of monoconscious, misandrist, gender criminal judges have been murdered by masculist soldiers, you will stop your massive gender crimes against men, forcing them into manslavery, working for 2 decades of men's lives, paying for a kid he doesn't want. So adapt or die. End quote. All of the above flashed across my mind when I saw that the large majority of the women in the audience clapped. That is, the large majority of women are massive gender criminals who can only be persuaded to suppress their hardwired, evolved instinct to sexploit men by threat of death, by a sex war. I'm coming more and more around to the idea that women are truly childlike in their inability to place themselves in the shoes of men, incapable of empathizing with the suffering of men at the hands of women's massive gender crimes against men. When men are collectively convinced of this idea, then men will punish women severely, probably taking away women's right to vote, treating them like irresponsible children, arguing that, quote, "women are children and children don't vote," end quote. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Author of the book Masculism, Men's Rebellion Against Being Man-Slaves to Women, an e-textbook of 570 plus masculist flyers for men's studies courses, freely downloadable in Microsoft Word format from my website. Ciao.